Freelance begins with disappointment. In a montage awkwardly told in first person, John Cena's Mason Pettits laments that he knows exactly what he's been put on this world to do, and yet he hasn't been able to do it. After becoming a lawyer and hating it, Mason quit to become a special forces operative, where he soon went on a mission to assassinate President Juan Venegas, Juan Pablo Raba, of Paldonia, that left him injured and with half of his team dead. Now, Mason is trapped in the nightmarish existence he feared. He's a lawyer, living a suburban life with his wife, an almost non-existent Alison, and his loving daughter. It doesn't take long into Freelance for us to realize that we begin to feel like Mason, as we know this absolutely isn't the type of garbage John Cena should be doing. Thankfully, Mason is soon saved from this hellscape of having a good job and a charming family when his former Special Forces buddy, Christian Slater, and his private military company hire him for a protection job. Mason has to escort journalist Claire Wellington, Alison Brie, into Paldonia for an interview with President Juan Venegas. Believing the president was behind the attack that led to his team's destruction, Mason has to deal with his issues with Venegas and protect Claire, all while the South American country of Paldonia undergoes a military coup. You know, just a standard setup for your run-of-the-mill action comedy. Freelance is an action comedy without solid action or comedy. John Cena and Alison Brie in Freelance image via Relativity Media. From Pierre Morel, director of Taken, From Paris with Love, in the truly atrocious Peppermint, Freelance continues his trend of bland, unremarkable action films. Freelance looks cheaply made, and while this film puts Cena, Brie, and Raba in a chase for their lives across Paldonia, this always looks as though it was filmed on backlots and green screens. The action is never exciting, the jokes never land, and the pacing is all over the place. Freelance takes an absurd amount of time to get going, as it slogs through Cena's Mason whining about where his life is at before we ever get lost in Paldonia. Morel never makes any attempt to turn this into the grand adventure that it seemingly wants to be. But writer Jacob Lentz is also largely to blame for this disaster, with weird pacing, terrible humor, and an overly convoluted narrative that heads into some extremely questionable territory. Freelance fundamentally feels like an amalgamation of several different ideas, none of which amount to much at all. It begins with a surprisingly mean-spirited sense of humor, as Mason jokes about how his suburban life would probably lead him to have an affair, and rolling his eyes at having to drive his daughter to school. Once the journey through Paldonia begins, Freelance becomes even more muddled, as this sometimes tries to be a half-assed love triangle between three characters that only show romantic interest occasionally, or if there's nothing else to do within the scene. Sometimes, Mason seems completely in control of the situation he's thrown into, and other times, he's like a little kid uncertain how to act. There's not even any real stab at humor, except for President Venegas' constant joking about Mason's last name. Yet most confounding is how excessively complex Lynch tries to make what should have been a relatively simple concept. Instead of getting into the action or the comedy, Freelance stops itself dead in its tracks to go over and over the laborious plotting of this story. There are several minutes of Slater's character trying to convince Cena's Mason that he should do this job, which as we've seen is his dream job. But worst of all is how labyrinthian Lynch tries to make the politics of the Paldonia, complete with mercenaries, dictators, and corporately funded coups. With all these ups and downs, overthrowing of governments and changes of power, dictators become friends, violence becomes justified, and Freelance ends up becoming a hail of gunfire that never feels earned, thematically fitting. Or like any of this setup was essential for what seemed like a romp through the woods. John Cena and Alison Brie deserve better than Freelance. Alison Brie and John Cena in Freelance image via Relativity Media. Unfortunately, this cast full of actors who can do better get lost in this mess. Cena does his best to bring a light-hearted approach to Mason, despite the weird dislike of settling down and his penchant for murdering, but the script and lack of any real jokes don't help him in that regard. Meanwhile, Brie, who has often shown she can be charming and hilarious, is wasted here, frequently becoming either a damsel in distress or becoming the center of attention for her attractiveness. Freelance really shows it mishandled these actors during the end credits bloopers, where we see both Cena and Brie playing and goofing around on set,